Johnston, and I'm with Transition Advisors. Our webinar today, specifically for Texas CPAs, is called Valuing Public Accounting Firms, Succession, Acquiring, or Merging. Before we begin, we need to cover just a few important items. First, please close any programs running on your computer other than GoToWebinar. This will help us to ensure quality presentation and reduce any audio issues today. Transition Advisors, LLC is a proud and approved sponsor on the National Registry of CPA Sponsors per NASBA and by the Texas State Board of Public Accountancy. In order for you to receive your 1 CPE credit, you must complete 2 requirements. First, you must participate in all 3 polling questions throughout the presentation. Please note that GoToWebinar does monitor your participation in the polls. Next, an online evaluation will appear immediately after the session ends today, and you must complete that in order for us to email your CPE certificate of completion. So please be sure to take a moment to complete that survey before you close the browser when the webinar ends. Once both of the requirements have been met, the certificate will be emailed to you within 10 business days. Now, in order for you to fully participate in the webinar today, please take just a moment to familiarize yourself with the GoToWebinar control panel. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen. The orange arrow near the top of the panel will minimize it. During the presentation, all participants are muted, but you can communicate with us by using the question box toward the bottom of the panel. You can type your question in the box and click Send. Questions are very important to us, and our presenter today will answer your questions throughout the presentation, time permitting. Finally, I'd like to remind you that Transition Advisors offers a free 1-hour CPE webinar each month. Our upcoming topics include valuing your accounting practice, a 2014 accounting update, and a session on partnership agreements. You can find a complete list of our webinars, including links to register for them, by visiting the CPE courses section of transitionadvisors.com. One final reminder, you did receive a link to download today's slides in the email reminder. I've also just sent it to you via the chat function, so if you'd like to follow along, you can. If you'd like for me to email you a PDF after the webinar, you can send me a message by replying to any of the reminder emails that you received. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter for today's session. Russ Best is a partner with Transition Advisors. We thank you very much for joining us and hope that you enjoy today's webinar.
Hello, everyone. This is Russ Best. It is my pleasure to make this presentation to you all today. I also noticed that there are several of you that attended Terry's webinar on the 13th. I'll apologize a little bit ahead of time. Some of the slides are the same. However, I'll add a little bit different twist to it for you. One of the things that I guess is mandatory is getting a little bit of a ad for us in this, and that's what you're seeing right now. Transition Advisors, we are a national consulting firm. We work exclusively with public accounting firms and with issues related to ownership transition. We have designed our firm to be a very different type consulting practice. We primarily will introduce buyers and sellers together. We do a turnkey type solution for both the buyers, who are our clients, and also the sellers. We will handle just about everything for you, from initially making the introduction to establishing meetings, to advising on those meetings. We also write the letter of intent. We'll help in negotiations, and typically we'll write the contract also. We've also reached a major goal in our firm. About 30% of our revenue stream right now comes through consulting with public accounting firms. We not only help them through transactions, but we'll also help them through partnership compensation type issues, partnership agreement drafting also. So there is the blurb on Transition Advisors. Now, as you all of you are attending, either have an interest in buying a firm, being acquired, or some succession issues. That is what we specialize in. We have found through the years that basically there may be 50 things you need to know about any individual transaction. The smartest of us will only think of 35. Now, in our experience, we've been involved in over 1,000 transactions. We have handled a number of issues in every one. Every transaction is a little bit different. There are new ones every day too. So we are very well experienced in this. There's very few things that can happen that we haven't already dealt with. One of the questions that I always get from firm owners is why in the world is activity so high? The AICPA came out with a finding this year that they're expecting more merger and acquisition activity in the next 5 years than our profession has experienced in its entire lifespan to date. 2006 through 2008 was 14 is already kicking off extremely well. One of the major reasons that I think firms are looking to either be acquired or certainly to buy is for niche development. Most of us on this line are probably baby boomers. We're also looking forward to some type of retirement or cutting back our hours. One of the biggest impacts on this activity is the demographics of our profession itself. In 1993, over 40% of CPAs were over 40. In 2012, that number has rose to over 70%. The CPA has also said that right now about 64% of CPAs are over 50 years old. Folks, we've got to do something if we want to secure our investments in our firm and realize the best value we can. Hopefully I can answer many of your questions with regard to that. Right now, succession is the major driver of most acquisitions and certainly buyings also. 67% of firms have stated that they expected at least 1 to 5 partners to retire within the next 5 years, with more than half saying that they'll have 1 partner retire. That's well up from our 2008 numbers. Now, in addition, as firm owners and CPAs, we're constantly concerned with how do we grow this business. Certainly, I think most of us have grown our businesses 1 client at a time. Currently, a lot of activity is being driven by developing marketable niches, and we'll talk briefly about the type of niches that we're seeing happen. Probably one of the most prominent ways to grow very rapidly today is either through merger or through acquisition of another firm. Now, I have done a lot of consulting with public accounting firms and certainly corporate clients, and one of the things that I will tell you, you can grow also through increasing the number of transactions that you do with your clients and the size of those transactions. And I think that, again, tracks right back to the type of niches and services that your firm can provide. So growth is something that certainly we can help you do. Now, you're looking at a slide right now by Show Me the Money by Jerry Maguire. All of you are wondering at this point, how do I maximize the value of my practice when I do sell or when I acquire? Now, I will tell you that that is, as you're going into this type process, certainly a concern, but we're finding amongst all of the firms that we're dealing with today that the finances, the money involved in the transaction is becoming secondary to concerns that we have about will our clients be taken care of? Will our employees stay in place? Can we maintain our professionals? All of these are questions that are beginning to overshadow that issue of show me the money. Now, one of the most common questions I get from my buyer clients as well as the sellers that we represent is, what is the multiple? And I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here, folks. The value of an accounting firm obviously is based on a multiple. However, that multiple is a little bit different than what we're used to in dealing with our corporate clients. Very rarely, and I will touch on this later in the presentation, very rarely as we're dealing with corporate clients, their value is largely based upon EBITDA. Within public accounting firms, that takes less of a role in the value of an accounting firm. Once a multiple is established, it is not applied typically to EBITDA, but rather to the revenue stream of the firm within the last year. So we will cover that multiple. The next slide is a first polling question that we have, and Nikki, I'll turn it over to you to kind of bring that slide up so they can answer the poll question.
Okay, thanks, Russ. Our first polling question today is, which of the following does your current partnership or operating agreement include? You can see that we have 4 different options there, and you'll select one. So take just a moment here to read through those choices, and do keep in mind that you need to answer the polling questions in order to receive the CPE credit today. Okay, we'll wait about 10 more seconds. If you haven't answered yet, go ahead and take a look at those and see which one applies. Great. It looks like we have nearly everyone answered, so we'll go ahead and close the poll here. And Russ, to let you know, 75% of respondents said that they don't have a current partnership agreement. Another 17% indicated the partner buyout parameters only, with the remaining folks on the line saying the partner buyout and partner buy-in parameters.
Well, I appreciate that, Nikki, and thank you all for taking part in that. Your responses do not surprise us. We're finding that most firms out there do not have partnership agreements. And one of the ways that obviously a firm, as they are growing, increases their value and growth potential is through the admission of new partners. Obviously, that is going to need a partnership agreement. Look into it. It's something that you all do need to have. Well, let's talk about some of the things that the reason you are here. Let's talk about the principles of value, if we can. Hold on just one second. I had something take over my screen here. Okay. Sorry about that. A little technical difficulties here. Okay. Many of us approach selling or buying a public accounting firm very much as we would selling or buying a car or a house. The first thing we attempt to do is find out what the practice is worth, somehow list it, then go for the best deal we can that will give us the most money for the quickest return. What we will teach you through the seminar is there are additionally things that you need to be concerned about. Now, one of the ways that our business, our practice, if you will, is unique from your corporate clients is that our practice value is primarily based upon our ability and that of the buyer to successfully generate new clients and to transition those clients from you, in the case of being an acquirer or acquiree, to the buyer firm. Now, if you'll recall, I know all of you have consulted with some of your corporate clients. One of the primary ways that a corporation increases its value is by making the owner of less importance to the transaction itself. As much as you can systematize the business, take the owner out of the loop, and have the business operate on its own, the more value that corporate business will have. Ladies and gentlemen, that is no different in public accounting firms. If you have successfully managed to transition your relationships to your employees, to your professionals, and eventually to a successor firm, that also enhances value. Very much. In fact, one of the primary questions that I'll receive from a buyer after the initial meeting with a possible firm to acquire is, what type of a job has this owner done in transitioning their relationships with their clients? So the more you can make that happen, the better you can make that happen, the better off you are. One of the things also, particularly if you're in the shoes of possibly being acquired, is don't forget, the buyer has to make a profit in this transaction or it will not happen. What we tell both our clients, the buyers, and the sellers that we represent is the best deal possible is a deal that is fair to both the buyer and seller. That's what we strive to achieve. And if the seller, if you will, can understand the importance of the buyer making a profit in the early stages of the transaction, much more smoothly will the transaction go. That is something that we work with each our clients and the sellers. One of the other things that I think you need to understand, and those of you who are buyers I'm sure can relate to this, what's on the buyer's mind? The buyer is constantly looking at the transition plan that the seller may have. That is one of the things that we insist sellers have an idea of prior to even being presented to a buyer. What we're running into quite a bit is that if there is anything that can delay a transaction or slow it down or make it not happen, is too many have-to-haves on behalf of the seller. Now, those things take many forms. For example, if the seller is insisting that they need to stay in their facility, that is a detriment to the transaction. If they're insisting that all the professionals and employees of the firm must stay with the successor firm, that can be a negative, although I will tell you that most firms today welcome the opportunity to bring in new and qualified professionals into their firm. One of the things that we run into every day is existing long unexpired leases. What we try to coach the sellers that we represent on is that if your lease is a year or less, that is ideal. If it's more than a year, there are issues that we could encounter, and fortunately we have successfully dealt with many of those issues. But a lease is definitely a detriment to closing a transaction if it cannot be dealt with. The other dot point that you see in front of you is no meat on the bone. And basically what we're talking about there is in any transaction, the buyer has to foresee profit in the very near future. Many of our buyers are realistic and realize that profit may take as much as 18 months, but rarely should it take any more than that. There has to be meat on the bone. Now, that meat on the bone can take the form of profits to the buyer. It can take the form of additional opportunities that your client base as a seller presents to the successor firm. It can also take the form of economies that can be realized by bringing the two firms together. So that is one of the primary things that we instruct our buyer clients and also the sellers that we represent. Show us where the meat is on that bone. Also, one thing to keep in mind is accounting firm transactions are very different than a typical corporate acquisition or sale, if you will. Our transactions have to cash flow for the buying firm. I mentioned earlier, if it does not cash flow and have profitability in less than 18 months, it probably is not going to occur. So from the get-go, both the buyer and the seller has to be thinking about cash flow and how whatever terms the transaction may have can impact that cash flow. One of the other things that I will tell you is the risk must be shared between both the buyer and the seller to have an effective transaction. Now we've come to our second polling question, and Nikki, if you'll take it over from there.
Great, thanks, Russ. The second polling question is, within the next 5 years, how does your firm plan on growing the business? Your options this time are organic growth only, organic growth plus merger or acquisition, or you plan to keep the firm the same. So just a reminder that you do have to answer all of the polling questions in order to get the CPE credit. So if you haven't yet cast your vote, we'll keep it open for another 10 seconds or so that you can. Great, thanks everyone. We'll go ahead and close the poll now. Russ, to let you know, 54% indicated organic growth only, with another 38% choosing the second option, the organic growth plus acquisition or merger. And then 8% of the attendees today said that they plan to keep the firm the same.
Very good, Nikki. Thank you. And your responses do not surprise us once again. Many firms are looking for that organic growth. If you want to supercharge that growth, an easy way to do that, or an easier way to do that, is through acquisition or merger. Now let's talk about the reason you're here. we believe very strongly, and we have proven time and time again, that there exist 5 main variables for valuing a practice. Now, these relate directly to the specific terms that any transaction may entail. One of the largest variables to valuing a practice or achieving that multiple is how much cash is involved up front, if any. Now, obviously, some of our businesses are fairly seasonal. Most of our revenues may come around tax time. If a transaction is attempted to close outside of that time frame when the revenue stream is coming in, that could be an issue. It is very dependent upon the time of the year and obviously the ability of both firms to cover the working capital of the firm. The deal's cash flow itself is also very important. One of the things that should not surprise any of you is whether we like it or not, the markets that we deal in right now have dictated that basically most public accounting firms' transactions are based on the traditional earn-out type method. I have many of my sellers that we represent very concerned that the firm is being paid for with their own money. I'm sorry, but that is the way it is today. Most of the deals that are done in our marketplace are earn-out type basis. Now, accounts receivable really plays a very large role in the cash that a selling owner may be able to achieve. It is very, very common that once a transaction is closed, any accounts receivable or work in process that exists within the selling firm at the effective date of that contract does remain with the selling owner. Now, this is typically cash the selling owner does not have to put into working capital. It is cash that you would not have realized had the transaction not occurred. So cash up front is a very important item. I will also tell you our experience in the marketplace today is the traditional heavy cash deals where cash was exchanged up front are few and far between today. That is largely, I think, a function of the economy, banking relationships, and their reluctance to loan money on accounting firm transactions. Some of that is being done, but not much. We hear very few cases which we would refer to as heavy cash upfront deals. Unfortunately, the market is just not supporting that today. And if you think about it, heavy cash up front presents a very high level of risk for the buying or the successor firm. So this is very important in arriving at a multiple. Typically, in most of the transactions that we do, if there is cash involved in the transaction, and we'll talk about a two-stage deal, any cash advance is typically only paid at the beginning of the buyout payments, or in a two-stage deal at the beginning of stage 2. Probably 98% of the time, that cash advance is then credited against the first 2 years of the buyout payments. Again, the driver here is cash flow. Let's talk about the second major variable of arriving at that multiple, and that is who bears the risk of client retention. Now, once again, there are a number of alternatives, one of which we're seeing most prevalent in the marketplace. The first point is collection-type deals. Now, a collection-type deal is a situation where an accounting firm transaction is done by applying the negotiated multiple applied to the collections from the clients of that seller for a period of time. Now, what a collections-based deal does is it places almost entirely the risk of client retention on the selling firm's back, if you will. If the seller loses a client in the term of the transaction, they don't get paid for it. There are a number of ways to get around this and to minimize the risk to the seller of doing a collections-based deal. The second dot point that you see there is a fixed transaction itself. That would be a situation where a firm received a fixed price for their firm, that fixed price would typically be paid over a period of time. It could also be a situation where there is a blending type of transaction where a portion of the transaction is the price is fixed and the remainder is based on collections. I will tell you, in our experience in the last 3 years, fixed price deals are, again, few and far between. We also are running into a situation where we're seeing requests for what we refer to as limited guarantees associated to a transaction. Now, basically, this could take the form of either a transaction or the price of a transaction, either having a ceiling or a floor. Let's take an example. If you have $1 million firm looking to be acquired and a limited guarantee was in place, at a one-time multiple you would expect to get $1 million for that firm. In a limited guarantee type environment, what would happen is you would lock the value of your firm on a percentage type basis at some point in time in the transaction. Now, basically, that would guarantee if this was a $1 million firm with a 5-year buyout, there could be a floor to that transaction of $500,000 in total, possibly at the second year of the buyout based on the preceding 12 months revenue stream. That would be a limited guarantee. The other thing that we're seeing quite a bit now is the attempt to negotiate what we call economy clauses. Now, an economy clause relates to anything that could impact the ultimate financial transaction itself. For example, we have negotiated deals most recently where the seller has taken part in the growth of the revenue stream to his client base if they are an integral part of that. Very often what we see is percentages may be put in place that if the firm or the revenue stream from the client base grows over 20% of where it was at the effective date of the contract, the seller could take part in that growth. That is an ideal situation. Now, more times than not, an economy clause may take the negative form. And you'll hear me refer to this later as we talk to large firms, talk about large firm transactions. There is an existence out there, negotiations that refer to what we refer to as a clawback clause in a transaction itself. That is the negative of taking part in growth. Basically, what a clawback clause could say that if the revenue stream of the selling owner's clients decreases by X percentage, the multiple may change at that point also. We do our best to stay away from those. They are being requested now probably more than we've seen ever before. So again, an economy clause is anything that could impact the financial stream of the buyout transaction itself. Once again, let's go back. Collection deals are the most prevalent. I would tell you right now in our experience, probably 90 to 95% of the transactions that we've seen in the marketplace in the last 3 years have been collections-based deals. Now, the third major driver of the multiple does deal with profitability. Now, I mentioned earlier in our discourse that EBITDA rarely comes into the valuation of a public accounting firm. However, profitability is very important. Profitability of the selling firm itself will dictate, and this is the fourth point, the length or term of the buyout period. It does impact that directly. But what the seller must demonstrate to the buyer in most forms is that they can profit from making the transaction. Now, profitability from a seller can come from a different a number of different areas. Probably the easiest to make happen is if the seller leases their facility. In a very short period of time, that lease goes away, and the seller can then move into the successor firm's facility. That is profit to the buyer. We've eliminated a lease. Overhead reductions is another way that the buyer could realize profitability early in the transaction. A third way that we instruct sellers to look at their practice base is which of your clients has potential to increase the revenue stream if new products and services were offered to that client that can be performed by the successor firm. That certainly is viewed as profitability from the buyer, if you will. Now, something we run into quite a bit also is successor firms who do financial services. That would be the buying, selling of financial instruments, everything from insurance to stock. Obviously, they would be very interested in introducing those services into the sellers that we represent. That does dictate it turns into profitability for the buying firm. The caution that I would give both you as a buyer or you as a seller is financial services in themselves are a great product and service. What we look at is how are those services marketed. The last thing that a seller wants is basically for the seller's client base to be taken advantage of, if you will, through selling financial services. If marketing occurs just by need to the seller's clients, that's fine. I don't think any seller would want their firm acquired surely as an instrument to build a financial services practice for the successor firm. It's an important, very important service. It has value, but be careful with how that is presented to a selling firm. Now, the third dot point on this section of the screen is probably has the biggest impact on the multiple of any of the points that we're discussing with you today. The tax ramifications of the deal structure itself can have the biggest impact on the multiple of any of the others. The two extremes are basically doing a goodwill transaction or an asset purchase. Basically what that is, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, is a capital gains type transaction. What you all know is that if the successor firm does do an asset purchase or a goodwill purchase, basically they are having to write that transaction off over 15 years. The other extreme in many of the deals that we do is a current deduction, and we refer to that as a consulting-based transaction. This is a situation where the seller has agreed to accept the buyout payments as ordinary income as they go forward. In this type situation, the attraction to a successor firm obviously is that that investment or the purchase of the firm can be written off virtually immediately. That certainly has a major impact on the multiple itself. In our experience, the difference between doing a consulting-based transaction where the selling owner accepts it as a current deduction versus a goodwill purchase can have as big an impact as 10 to 20 to 25 points of the multiple. It can make a difference from a one-time multiple upwards to a 1.25 multiple in many, many cases. And folks, the numbers work if you put the pen to pencil, paper to pencil. The fourth major driver of valuing a practice, or that multiple, is the length of the payout period itself. Now, that is driven almost entirely by the net profit and the cash flow of the transaction itself, but the net profit of the selling firm. It has been our experience that if a seller has a net profit of between 30 and 35% or less, the period most likely will be 5 years. If, on the other hand, the seller has a net profit, or owner benefit, if you will, in excess of 35%, the payout period most likely will be 5 years. So that kind of is a rule of thumb that we tend to use. It is also being proven in the marketplace time and time again. I will also tell you that many times in a merger type situation where the seller falls under the successor firm's partnership agreement, the partner buyout itself could go as long as 8 to 10 years. Now, the fifth major variable is actually the multiple itself. And we believe strongly and can demonstrate that basically the multiple is the effect, the cause is the 4 major drivers that we have elaborated on in our earlier slides. A basic rule that you may have is that viewing a transaction or the terms of a deal as a balloon. If you modify one of the 4 variables that we have presented, it does have an impact on the multiple itself. If you push on the side of a balloon, it pops out on the other side. That definitely is the case with the multiple. Basic rule is that the lower the down payment, the longer the payout period, the higher the profitability, longer guarantees, you're going to achieve a higher multiple. Now, I will tell you our experience also in the Texas market today. If we were to take the 4 terms that we have presented, if a transaction takes the form of a collections-based deal, if there is minimal cash involved, if it is a consulting-based transaction, and it occurs over a reasonable period of time, as we've demonstrated and kind of given you the parameters, it is still happening within the Texas market today that with those terms, many firms can realize a 1.25 multiple. Now, we are beginning to see an extensive amount of pressure, particularly coming from the East Coast, on pressure on those multiples. And also larger firms tend to pay a smaller multiple also, as we will discuss. But basically, those are kind of rules of thumb. I would be happy to talk about the parameters of with each of you individually if you wish. Let's talk about some of the differences that we're seeing between larger firms and smaller firms. Larger firms typically go for a lower multiple and typically a longer payout period. The retention periods largely within a larger firm versus smaller firm tends to be more brand-oriented as opposed to partner loyal. Now, are they still happening on a collections-based deal? Absolutely. However, we do see on occasion, particularly where the successor firm is the buyer, that there is sometimes cash involved up front. What we do see very repeatedly is that the larger the firm, the more partners or owners involved in that firm, it's never a total sale, but it's rather a combination of a sale, a merger, or a 2-stage deal individually constructed very often for each one of the partners. We also have seen in the marketplace, again, particularly on the East Coast, that larger firms are purchasing and acquiring firms often with as small a multiple as a 0.8 multiple. Now, there are other things involved in that. It needs to be understood what that multiple contains and some of the parameters of the transaction itself. Let's switch to talking about what type of deal structures are out there. Now, all of us have heard of the outright sales. This is a situation that I'll get into briefly where the sale is immediate. One of the things that we specialize in is what we refer to as a 2-stage transaction. I'll go into that in more detail. We're also seeing call-out sales and sales versus mergers. Now, within an outright sale, basically the purchase payments begin immediately. Very often, the selling owner may still be working, but in a reduced capacity. Sometimes they work without being compensated, or they're working on a per diem type basis. The disadvantage of this is being that most deals are being done on a collections type basis, and outright sale offers a very limited time for the selling owner to properly transition their clients. We do not recommend this, but we see it. The most typical deal that we're involved in is a two-stage transaction. Now, during stage one, and it usually, stage one could last from anywhere from 2 to 5 years. Basically, the selling owner is going to contract with their successor. The successor owns their firm. At the onset, in effect, they merge their practice into the successors. The start of the transition process begins. The owner typically will continue to serve their clients as they always have. However, now with the added intent to properly transition those clients to the successor firm. Very often, the selling owner will at that point take on either a principals or a non-equity partner role or a subcontractor to the combined firm. It is our goal in most of these transactions, and also the sellers, to maintain their compensation levels equivalent to what they have currently. That is very common. Now, very often, my astute buyer clients will tell me, well, if I pay the selling owner the equivalent of their net margin applied to collections, I am at a break-even situation at best. And on the surface, I would absolutely agree with that. However, we talked about the need for profitability and where it can come from for the buyer client, and that applies directly to stage one. I would not advise any of my clients to do a deal where they could not realize profit in the very early stages of a transaction like this. Now, within a two-stage deal, stage two basically is the process of getting paid for the practice. Basically, the selling owners at that point can slow down, assume a part-time role, or totally retire. If the selling owner would continue to work and receive buyout payments, again, cash flow is the guide, they typically would receive compensation at a per diem type rate. In addition, getting paid for the practice, they're getting paid for the practice that is already transitioned at that point. It is an ideal situation. Very often, the selling owner at this point becomes a new business developer for the combined firm, obviously making both parties very happy. We're also seeing a lot of call-out type sales. This, in a nutshell, is selling only a part of the practice, possibly retaining a part of the practice. It can be related to either selling individual clients, particular service offerings, or locations from which the seller may operate. Typically, the selling owner will stay involved with those sold clients. Once again, a call-out sale is only selling a portion of their practice. Let's go to sale versus merger. The key difference between these two types of transactions is the ownership status of the selling owner themselves. Typically, within a merger, the selling owner has agreed to abide by the acquirer's partnership agreement, and upon their ultimate buyout, they will fall under the terms of that partnership agreement. That is the thing that within a merger, the smaller firm typically has to pay particular attention to. In a merger situation, typically the seller is often faced with, should I take equity in this firm or not? That is a negotiable point. I believe very strongly it deals with the amount of risk that that selling owner wants to continue to have. It also deals with their age. It makes sense to invest equity in this firm if I'm in my late 60s. That is a question that only that firm's owner can answer. However, it always becomes a point of negotiation in a merger. We're now to our final polling question. Nikki, if you can kind of take that away.
Sure. Our third and final polling question today is, within the next 5 years, how many of your partners/owners are planning on retiring? So your options there are none, 20 to 50%, or more than 50%. We'll give everyone just a couple seconds here. It's a pretty quick poll. Keep in mind you do need to answer all three in order to get your CPA credit. Okay, we'll go ahead and close the poll now. Half of the respondents said more than 50%. Another quarter indicated none, and the final quarter, the 20 to 50% option, Russ.
Fantastic. Not surprising at all. It's very endemic for our market right now. Okay, let's go on to possibly one of the reasons that you're attending this webinar, and that's what's unique in Texas. As a Texan, guys, I'm currently live in Kansas City, but I am from Texas. I will tell you, you have somewhat of a unique marketplace. It is a very attractive marketplace. Unfortunately, there's a lot of disinformation in the Texas market right now. That disinformation very typically takes the form of the abundance of cash-heavy deals that are taking place within our marketplace. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you that is not the case. Very often I run into many owners who are looking to sell their firm only expecting to realize heavy cash in the transaction itself. Very often they will sign an exclusive agreement, very often with a broker, thinking they are going to get this, and in a very large percentage of those cases, that does not occur. So the major disinformation in the marketplace is that a lot of heavy cash deals are being done in our market. That is not true. There are some, but they are few and far between. I'm also very pleased to tell you that a lot of firms are reaching out on their own to identify firms. We're a proponent of that. There's a lot of activity, major firms that you've probably been contacted by that are going out on their own looking for acquisitions or mergers. That's great. If you find yourself in this type of situation, we would be happy to support you as best we can. The other thing I will tell you is transactions in Texas are taking longer than I've ever seen it. Texas used to be a very rapid marketplace. Very often a deal would close in about 2 months or less after a seller went to market. That is no longer the case. Deals are now taking as much as 6 months. The other thing that I'm very pleased to tell you is that there are a lot of large national and international firms seeking a viable presence in our Texas market. That is fantastic. Texas is a very desired marketplace right now, and done correctly, we'll continue to see those transactions take place. So those are some of the things that are unique to Texas, and I'm very pleased with many of them. Let me talk just briefly before we wrap up here about some tricks and tips that you may consider. Often we're asked, should you shorten the retention period as much as possible? Again, in any of these cases, remember the balloon. If you press on the retention period, very often it is going to result in a smaller multiple if you're looking for a guaranteed or less retention period. If you have managed your clients properly, if you transition them properly, retention should not be a major issue. In addition, how can you increase your value through the buyer's profitability? This is a fantastic question, and it's something that every selling firm ought to be asking themselves. How can your value increase with the aid of the successor? If you can do this and demonstrate to the buyer or your successor, you're going to negotiate a much better return for yourself. Should you go for capital gains treatment? Obviously, you can get a larger multiple if you do a consulting-based transaction. However, many firms are looking for capital gains. The one thing I will tell you is you'll get a higher multiple for collections, and you also have the opportunity, which we've helped many firms through, of setting up a deferred benefit retirement plan in conjunction with a consulting-based transaction that will help you in the tax consequences of doing an ordinary income type deal. Should you negotiate a shorter payout period? That again, think of the balloon. Anything that impacts the cash flow of the deal itself will negatively impact the multiple. We can help you through any of those questions. The rule of thumb that we constantly use is minimal risk leads to maximum return for both the buyers and the sellers. At that point, ladies and gentlemen, I think we are at the conclusion of the presentation. I thank you very much for attending. My contact information is here. I would gladly field any questions you may have. Once again, I will thank you once again for attending. Nikki,
thanks, Rusty. We did have one question, if you don't mind taking a moment to answer.
Go.
What about the need for tail insurance coverage for malpractice? Who pays for this if the coverage is taken out?
If it is an acquisition, typically the selling firm, that insurance can be negotiated as being taken over by the successor firm. However, we have seen cases, and this was up for negotiation, where the insurance continued to be covered out of the return that the seller was recognizing. More times than not, though, the successor firm will take that over, but it's definitely a point of negotiation. I hope that answered your question.
Great. Thanks so much, Russ. As Russ mentioned, if you do have any further questions, feel free to contact him directly at the email address that you see on the screen or by calling the phone number there. You can also reply to any of the emails that you've gotten from GoToWebinar, and that'll come directly to me, and I'm happy to forward any of those questions on to Russ as well. I did want to remind everyone that before you close your browser today, to please take a moment to complete the evaluation that will pop up on the screen. That evaluation is mandatory by NASBA in order for us to issue your CPE certificate, so take a moment to do that. Again, we do appreciate your time today. We thank you so much for attending. If you have any questions, feel free to follow up with us, and if not, we hope to see you on a future webinar. Thanks so much.